Okay.
Okay.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. So glad that you're here. This is actually the second time we've addressed family violence in one way or another, but this is more of an integrated approach. We are really interested in something. Right now, we think that there's a real disjointed, generally speaking, a very disjointed approach and system to addressing family violence. You know, men are in one corner, women are another corner, whether they're batterers or or victims. Kids, I have to say, are generally speaking barely less than an afterthought in all this. But I know that there are people, many of you are on this call, who want to take a different approach, and we want to see what that looks like. One that's more looking at the family as a whole, at interventions that are inclusive, that are gentle, that nurture and heal, and we know already that they have astonishing results in terms of solutions. So what we're going to explore today is what that looks like. Are there different interventions for different stages of family troubles? What's the language we use? Are there things that can be done now, right now, in this time of COVID, by friends, neighbors, loved ones to help troubled families? And what would a system of caring look like that we and others in this movement can put together as the pandemic begins to pass? So the folks that are with us today are James Encinas. He's a social entrepreneur and creator of a batterers intervention program for men and women. We had planned on having Dorothy and Steve Halley, but they were unable to come this time, and they will be with us at another time. Judy Knapp, Director of PreventionWORKS in Dorado County, California, who I think is the first person I knew who learned about the ACE study the same year that the first publication was published, and that was in 1998. And then Nada Yorke, she is with Yorke Consulting in Sequim, Washington. And she created a pretty remarkable batterers intervention program and has been using it for several years now and has some good data, remarkable data. It's being used in several states and a couple of countries. So I want to just jump in with one thing that I'm going to post right now, which I'm sure some of you have seen, which is the Blue Shield of California Foundation publication that was called Breaking the Cycle and Taking a Life Course Framework. I want to just read a part of it, and this is just one of the, or two of the points that they make in this really useful, I think, white paper that they put out a couple years ago now. And two of the points are the limitations of punitive approaches. This paper assesses the impact of the punitive paradigm, which undergirds the domestic violence safety net. And while it isn't vitally important to hold harm doers accountable, the paper finds that focusing primarily on the arrest and prosecution of perpetrators may actually create more harm than good for some victims, and that truly reducing domestic violence requires an earlier and more comprehensive approach to prevention. The paper lifts up the second point of the 6 that they have here. The paper lifts up key insights from the research and translates them into actions that can form the basis of a forward-looking agenda to prevent and end domestic violence. Among the key actions recommended, focusing excuse me, on a 2-generation interventions that serve both the parents and the children, reevaluating punitive approaches and systems, addressing data gaps, viewing prevention through an equity lens, and more. But that gives you the gist of that paper. What I want to do now is to focus on, well, actually what I'll first do is ask James to say something about that paper, because it was a friend of his who was one of the people who put it together, and he had long conversations with her as she was doing it. So James?
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, Tia Martinez is a colleague, friend, and mentor of mine. I met her when I became an Aspen Fellow, and she was one of my facilitators. She did go on to write this paper, and I think, and I don't know if we'll make it accessible, but I think it's a paper that's important for everyone to look at. One of the conversations, Tia took me under her wing. When I became an Aspen Fellow, I was in a room of 20 of us, teachers, national teacher leaders, asking myself, what am I doing here? Most of these individuals graduated from Harvard and Stanford and Yale. I didn't have that journey. And part of that is because I grew up in domestic violence. I did not do well in school. It's difficult to be up till 4 o'clock in the morning watching your parents fighting and hitting each other and hurting each other, and pay attention to the math lesson the next day. So I had a pretty indirect, I didn't participate, I didn't engage in learning. And then I end up as an Aspen Fellow, where I'm presented with the creation of the good community with people like Tia. And what I brought was my heart. And what they did is hold me and help me understand that knowledge is power. And I think around that time, after I left Aspen, I met Jane, and I was just infused with the desire to learn about the neuroscience and, how do we help people like myself who grow up in this world and then end up perpetrating and hurting not themselves, but just others. So I think the paper really speaks to that and other approaches that I think we're going to talk about here. And I'm really excited to be with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, James. And Judy, would you say a little bit about what you do, both for what you've done in the past with in your domestic violence work and the work that you're doing now in schools and in jails? You're muted.
There. Okay, sorry about that. Nice to see everyone. So yeah, like Jane was saying, I started incorporating ACEs in my work in 1998 at a domestic violence sexual assault center that I was working in. When I learned about this, it was a real aha moment for me personally as well, like James was saying. But how this could be incorporated into the work of any domestic violence sexual assault center. So what I asked others to do, I was the director of education and training. So I went out in the schools and incorporated the ACEs information in my dating violence prevention talks with teenagers, as well as my talk for adults. But my main focus was on children. But I asked the person who's in charge of our batterers intervention program to start keeping track and using that ACE score sheet to see, what was happening with people that were in the program as a batterer, both male and female. We had a program for both male and female batterers, as well as in the counseling program, what was happening with the victims as well. And basically what we noticed is, it's not, a big surprise to anyone here, but just noticing the high numbers of ACEs on both ends, whether it was a batterer or a victim, and being able to use that to say, hey, we need to start doing programs a little differently here. and helping these people understand that connection between their childhood and their current status in their relationship, and you know, filling in those pieces for them. So that's kind of what we started doing, and in a nutshell, basically, we started getting better results because of that. And just, you know, it helped victims overcome what they were going through a little easier, and help batterers understand their behavior and that cyclical nature of violence. And it's part of that healing process that they need. Currently, I kind of do the same thing. I have my own organization called PreventionWORKS now. Well, I do this in a jail, and I really think it's important because we see the recidivism here in El Dorado County. We have recidivism rates of over 70%, and so wanting to do something different, incorporating the ACEs information into they call the parenting program. We call the parenting program. It's a 16-week program, and incorporating ACEs and neurodevelopment and the impact of trauma on the developing brain in the jail. I always laugh because now the inmates know more than the correctional officers do about domestic violence and neurodevelopmental trauma and all those topics. And helping them heal and starting that process. It's really been a big eye-opener. And as we spoke about last time, one of the big eye-openers for me was the fact that, you know, women report themselves being battered just as much as the men do, and that we see more equality in that respect. Then we do see this big, you know, shift of men are the batterers and women are the victims. We don't see that. And what's really neat in the jail is that people are willing to talk. You know, I have a captive audience. I actually go into their pods and not in a classroom. So I'm really in their homes. And so, you know, we really have some really good discussions about these topics. And I've learned so much from them as well on how to help people heal from this. I'll leave it at that right now, James.
Thank you. Can you say a little bit about your work and the impact it's had? I think there's probably quite a few people on the call who who weren't on the previous one.
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm a retired probation officer, and the work I did, especially when I was assigned to our victim witness unit, was what really influenced my continuing the work in domestic violence, not only working with, having worked with victims and families in domestic violence, but deciding to start to work with the person who was actually perpetrating the violence. So some of that came from my work in supervising. Most of my probation career was spent working with adults who were in the felony system. And so, you know, realizing the impact later when I learned about ACEs, seeing how much that had influenced the lives of the folks that I was working with as a probation officer. And then looking at that intergenerational piece, because I was there long enough to start to see the next generation come through the system. So one of the things that struck me in a lot of the, when I was working victim witness, with a lot of the victims I worked with, was that for many of them, not all, but many of them simply wanted the violence to end. They weren't necessarily looking to break up the relationship. And even if they did, if the person was, if the batterer was not dealt with in a healthy way, then what happened is they just continued to abuse somebody else, and the children were continued to be exposed to that. So I ended up, when I retired, I went back to get my master's in social work, and I went into a level 4 prison in California and implemented a batterer program to see if in fact it might work differently. And what I noticed was I was working with men who were serving, many of them serving life sentences, at least 10 years or more. And I noticed that the material I brought in that I had access to as far as batterer intervention was not going to work. If I wanted to tell them how bad they were and how bad their behavior was, I could take a number and stand in line. They had been told that their whole life. So I needed to bring in some different material that helped them understand what it was like to have healthy relationships. So as a result of their commitment and their interest in learning what was healthy and what wasn't in relationships, that's when I decided to, I worked with a colleague who was running services for homeless people. And what she discovered was many of her clients kept going in and out of jail because they couldn't afford to finish their batterer intervention programs. So she got private funding from a Christian organization, and we ran a 52-week program, and the results were phenomenal. So not only did we remove the financial barrier, but we were able to introduce information on how to have healthy relationships from a holistic approach. And so I'm currently working on the research to submit it for peer review. But what I've noticed is that the numbers are just, they're not matching what's out there in the most of the research. In other words, we had high retention, we have low recidivism, and we actually have families that you see the healing taking place. So I appreciate the work that Jane's doing and bringing us all together to talk about how do we work with families and how do we meet those objectives. I will say a shout out to Linda Chamberlain, I noticed is on the call. When I was in Bakersfield, we had the pleasure of having her come twice when I was part of our domestic violence council. And she really opened my eyes to a lot of the ideas with understanding adverse childhood experiences, with understanding the value of how the brain works and how we can change the brain and continue to work on that. So yeah, I think there's probably a lot of people on this call that some names are jumping out at me that I'm thinking, yeah, you've done some work in this too. So I think it's exciting that we're all working together to try to come up with some solutions that don't look like what we've had in the past that maybe have not been as effective as we would like to have.
Thank you, Nada. And Linda, yes, I noticed that you were on, and I immediately said, okay, I'm glad that you're here. I didn't know if you're going to be able to make it, and we're definitely going to be calling on you. So I appreciate you being here. One of the things that I would actually like to address first, and then also get feedback from people who have joined, because I know a lot of you have been thinking about this for a while. What does an integrated ACEs science-informed approach look like? James, have you given any thought to that over the years? How would you structure it?
Yeah, I've given a lot of thought, Jane. I think, you know, through my own journey, I come to believe that violence is rooted in trauma, and the treatment of violence has to be aimed beyond just stopping the behavior, which has been the focus. Behavioral regulation, behavior reform, with the thought that if people stop their behavior, they're going to be okay. And they're not. They won't be fully okay until they deal with the fundamental issues, which are the roots of the problem. So I think the treatment of violence or approach to violence has to be rooted in nothing less than the restoration of the individual to themselves, their capacity to be in the present moment, whether the present moment is pleasant or not. And in order to come up with effective tools and practices and insights that help individuals live in the present moment, we have to deal with our ACEs, with our adversity in childhood. I did a workshop with Linda for Futures Without Violence a couple of years ago, I think now, Linda. And Linda has been another one of my mentors who's given me other modalities. She uses and teaches a program, tools from Capacitar, which is self-regulation tools. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to use a lot of different approaches to working with people like myself. And, you know, ultimately, I wrote a book, and I put a knife to my father's throat when I was 26 because of growing up in that world where there was a tremendous animosity between us. I was my mother's, as the oldest, I protected her. I experienced the first memory I have is him beating her when I was 3 years old. And I spent my whole life hating myself, hating him. feeling like the world was out to get me. And at the end of this latter part of my life, he was dying, and I went to take care of him. And I got to know him in a very different way. I got to bathe him, and I got to feed him, and I got to clean him, and I got to love him. And in doing so, I got to love myself. And I helped him transition in a loving way. So for me, like, the potential is there's a tremendous opportunity for change. But I think we need to move away from judgment and punishment. I think those of you who I'm sure read Brene Brown, you don't, people who are experiencing shame it's not a way to help them to move forward in their lives. And I went through one of these programs. I volunteered to go through a program with men that were remanded, and it was difficult for me to constantly be told what a bad person I was, and there weren't a lot of tools that I picked up. I did get the time out, which is one of the, coming to that realization that I didn't have to engage was incredibly powerful, so that there were other ways that I could choose to deal with the moment. But other than that, the men and women that I've worked with, we do art, we do yoga, we do meditation. We do, Linda right now is taking us through this amazing eye rest, relaxation of the body and awareness of the body. I wasn't even aware of my body until like my late 30s. I was just completely cut off from myself. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers your question, Jane, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to approach this from so many different ways. And I do want to give a shout out to Steve Haley. He's here. I know Dorothy wasn't able to be in. They don't do anything unless they do it together. So, but he has created a program at the Family Peace Initiative, the Art of Facilitation, which is really just a wonderful way that takes us through this understanding that hurt people, right. Oppress people, cruelty, people who experience cruelty learn how to be cruel. So I just want to leave it at that, but I think this opens up a tremendous opportunity for us, especially in this time of COVID-19, to look at maybe other ways of engaging with each other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, James. That's very helpful. So, so we have some examples of things to do differently when you're educating people about a different way of looking at why they do what they do. Judy, because you've worked in so many different types of organizations, have you given any thought to like what a system would look like that actually served everybody in the family that was dealing with family troubles?
Well, it's interesting because here in El Dorado County, it's something that we're working on countywide, is actually changing systems to be more inclusive like that, to be trauma-informed, to be thinking of the whole family piece, especially as we know the stats in regards to children, their outcome if their parents have been incarcerated. So right now we have formed a personal safety sector, part of our ACEs collaborative, and we're actually working with probation and law enforcement to actually change how their work is performed, so that we can get different results. So we're just pretty much at the initial phase of that. Getting law enforcement involved it's taken us 5 years to get law enforcement really involved to the level that they are now. And so I'm going to be documenting the process that we take, because as we know, the public safety system is one of the hardest nuts to crack. And but so far we're getting pretty good results. We're getting willing partners from public safety that want to look at their system and start doing things a little differently. So I don't have much to report there, but we're making great strides in our education system, getting teachers and staff educated on ACEs and trauma informed and what that looks like, and the neurodevelopmental impact on the brain. But again, with law enforcement, it's going to take a little longer.
And I have a follow-up question in that regard, because you all have been, Dorado County has had an ACEs initiative for what, three years now, I think?
We're going on, in August, we'll be starting our 6th year.
Oh, 6 year. Wow, a lot longer than I remembered. That's great. So in this, so you're making some headway in law enforcement. Excuse me. You're getting education. What other sectors do you need to integrate with this?
Well, we have 8 sector work groups that are working on integrating this in every system. We have a medical sector, we have a social service sector, we have community sectors, and because we have geographical issues here with South Lake Tahoe, being on the other side of the mountain, we have the South Lake Tahoe group, as well as what we call the Georgetown Divide, because that's a geographical separation from us. So as a whole county, we are working on this throughout different work sector groups, be it medical, social service, behavioral health, public safety, education, etc.
Okay,
And
great.
we have over 250 people in our collaborative working on this.
That's terrific. That's great. And Nada, can you, from your perspective, because you came out of probation, excuse me, into this, have you thought about what the system could look like that actually ended up serving a family in a non-punitive way?
Oh, absolutely. So some of the stuff that Judy and James have talked about are very similar to what we actually started years ago, decades ago now. I'm feeling old, but it was with our Domestic Violence Advisory Council. And so, Judy, as you're talking about law enforcement, of course, I was married to law enforcement. I was a peace officer, as a probation officer. So I had that inroad there. Where I could go to the chief and say, hey, I want the assistant to be on my committee. Will you authorize him? So, so those relationships are so important. I mean, really, when I look at how we put our DVAC together, we had a lot of the decision makers on the steering committee because they were the ones who could go back and make the changes in their own departments. So, for example, when we got that assistant chief, Bill, when he became chief, he instituted the October DV sweeps. He instituted dedicating a detective to domestic violence simply because he got educated by being part of this committee. So, we had faith leaders, we had the medical community, we had, of course, all of the courts and law enforcement. So we were bringing in all of those different entities to look at how could we solve this problem. So, like for one of the examples was we discovered that for victim witness, children could only access counseling services and monies to pay for counseling if they were mentioned in the report. So we put a subcommittee together, and all it took was putting a box on the police report forms that said, are there children in the home? Were they present? Do they live in this home? Because one of the things we know is just because you didn't witness the actual assault, and Jameson, you mentioned growing up in a home, I did too, but you come home from camp and you see holes in the wall and you see things broken and mom has a black eye. So yeah, you didn't actually witness the assault, but you're part of that home, that structure. So we wanted to make sure we captured that. So, but that's all it took, was just simply putting the brains together who said, oh, that's an easy fix. Just put a box on the report so the officer checks it. And so then we started working on how do we make sure that all the different entities are communicating with one another. And then at one point, the police department got a CalEMA grant to coordinate police officers, child protective workers, and the Alliance Against Family Violence victim advocates. And so they brought me in. I ended up doing like a 40-hour training with them. So it was not only team building, so how do you guys work together effectively, but it was also about training people who otherwise didn't understand the effect of ACEs, the effect of, what was going on when the children, like we did one exercise where I used Erickson's, development. And we looked at the different age groups and what does DV do to each of those different age groups? What will you see in that child in that age group that is going to be different? Here's what normal looks like, healthy looks like, and here's what they don't look like. So how do you approach the mother and be able to educate her that we're noticing this behavior. Could we call somebody that might be able to help you and your family work on this issue? And then flip side, I work with the offenders because, as James was saying, the first thing we would say is this is the no shame zone. People do not change when they are under fear, when they are feeling shamed. So it's not that your behavior is acceptable, but you are acceptable. You are a good person. You have value. So let's talk about how do we look at things like, James, what you brought up about forgiveness. The reason I designed 2 classes around forgiveness, and Dr. Fred Lushkin has some amazing work on forgiveness. But the reason was I had one gentleman who would have been considered a low risk offender, but yet he almost killed his partner. But because of some other dynamics, what happened was he had not forgiven his wife for going to the church and reporting what he had done, which ultimately resulted in him getting arrested. And so I designed these classes around forgiveness because that was what was holding him back from being able to really move forward, forgiving himself, but forgiving her as well. And so issues like restoration, I think, are so important. Months later, and I still wasn't sure he got it. He graduated, but I wasn't sure he got it until months later, he came back to sit on a panel for the next cohort that was going through and talked about what a blessed man he was and he details all of the stuff he had done to his wife and more than what we saw in the police report, and said, I am just so blessed that this woman took me back, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make that up to her and be the man that she deserves. I was like, oh my gosh, I almost fell out of the chair. But those are the kind of things that happen. So now we have a restored family. We don't just have somebody who graduated a program. We have a restored family. And so those are the factors I think we need to look at, is how do we approach them from that perspective, realizing that some of the research, there has been a little bit of research that men and or women who believe that their violence is negatively impacting their children are more likely to go get help, whether that means leaving the relationship or getting counseling. So I think we need to look at how do we connect with those folks from the perspective, we know you love your children, so how can we help you, have a healthier home, have a healthier family, so that your children don't have to walk the same steps you did. And so we talk about ACEs and resiliency. You need to recognize what your number is, but you can't change that. But we can help you be resilient. And so I think the last call I had mentioned Nan Henderson's work in resiliency in action. Amazing work. And so she allowed me to use some of that in my curriculum, because we want them to understand not only do you need to be resilient, but how do you help your children? How do you help your partner? Maybe if your partner's ACE score, we have them look at their partner's ACE score, because I think that helps to build empathy to understand why maybe their partner does certain things that are counterintuitive to them.
I just want to jump in before you give us another question, Jen, or I don't know where you're taking us, but just what Nada is saying is so important. This idea of restored family, but in the Blue Shield study that Tina was part of, 2 out of 3 of us who grow up in domestic violence go on to perpetrate, right? Mm-hmm. So the thing is so we keep pulling the babies out of the river, but we're not going to the root of the problem. And Linda did a wonderful video that,
because he could not control himself. I feel bad that he did not have access to good counseling programs where maybe he might have had a different life, a different outcome. And so I think these are important things for us to look at when we're talking about healing families. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Nada, and thank you, James. I want to turn to Linda now, because she's been doing did some interesting work in Finland, and I wonder if you could say more about that, and if you could unmute, Allison, if you could unmute Linda.
I think
Linda
you should go ahead and unmute yourself now.
Okay, so yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, it's great to see you. It's great to see everyone. I had a project for about 2 years in Finland, and I really didn't appreciate when I went there this whole family approach, but it really changed my thinking. And while it seemed in some ways radical at the time, I think it's where we're all heading, and I see lots of things happening along, with this great conversation. But I mentioned in the chat box, so I'll just, highlight a couple points about it. The first thing that happens when someone who's being victimized is accessing services and safety is secured, so safety is always first, is that there would be outreach to the abusive partner. It's called UC, is a Finnish name, and they would automatically be contacted, and it's what I was hearing and taking lots of notes here on the no shame zone to see how they could support that person. And one thing that's quite unique is automatically a person gets 5 private counseling sessions in Finland. And even when the economy was kind of going topsy-turvy, they started funding it, I think, with pull tabs or some source that we might not be all that fond of. But the point is that they would not let this go, because there was a very strong sense because of many people aren't going to be willing to go into group first. That first, when it is voluntary, that having some individual counseling then guide them into group where they know it's going to be, again, a supportive learning about how they grew up and how they were impacted, and understanding their behaviors, as opposed to maybe that shame blame mode. And there's a lot of there are things I could say that I know are very controversial, but they have worked very extensively with quote unquote couples counseling, which is something in my DV world I know is very controversial to say, and so maybe we call it something else. But there are lots of people who are being victimized who want to have contact in a way that it can be safe to do so. And they found that they had to meet people where they're at, as long as, again, safety could be secured. There's so much more to this that I know I could say things that maybe create a lot of concern without understanding how much thought was put into this. I'll just mention a couple other things. The work with children is very inclusive of the caregivers, both the parent who's being victimized and the parent who's being abusive. Again, when it's safe to do so, and a lot of clever thinking and tools for them to recognize. I remember these bear stickers from Australia that kids create a chain of their emotions, because these kids don't have good social emotional skills typically. So that's part of the target work anyhow, but then asking the children permission, so if their parent can see this, and how that helped the parent to realize how these kids are feeling. It was brilliant. Little things and little tools like that. So those are things that come to the top of my head. I guess as long as I'm stirring the pot a bit. Shelters, all the shelters in Finland are co-ed, and as an American, coming in, and the way I was trained, I had enormous, concerns, and interestingly, the thing that came up, as a problem was the men complaining sometimes about women not really having their bathrobe and stuff when they ran to the bathroom, because I just add a little, humor in here, because some cultures are different about this than perhaps Americans. And I thought this was something we'll never see in the States. And I was working fairly recently in Marshfield, Wisconsin, where a homeless shelter is becoming a DV shelter, and it's a co-ed shelter. So there are many, many things that have to be thought about, and this may be antithetical to how we do things in the state. But I think there are many gems within the work that they're doing. And when you see batterers intervention programs where the largest number of referrals is coming from guys calling in saying, I don't know, it seems like there's something wrong in my relationship. I can't put my finger on it. They're violent, but they're less violent than their parents were, so, you know, that's their norm as far as a healthy relationship. When we start to see that shift and who's coming for services, that gives me a lot of hope. So I'll just stop there, and I hope what I've shared with you is okay. And again, there's a lot more to it. So.
So how do we find out more about it if we want it? And also, what kind of results were they getting? Did it really change the outcomes that were happening in Finland?
It was definitely changing the. They work very closely with their child protection services. It's a very close relationship between the shelters and CPS, and so that was an important aspect of change. You know, I was doing qualitative work looking at this, but I was hearing about, you know, different data, and as well, I think that the pattern in terms of how people were coming into batterers intervention was the big change I was hearing, and I thought was fantastic for men and women who are abusive, calling themselves. They have a national, they don't call it coalition, but network of the programs that, you know, is where all the data goes. And I feel badly that I haven't sat down and written this up, but now that I'm, you know, sheltered in probably for a very long time up here, and this conversation came up, I have to think that I say that I'm thinking about reaching back to them to hear what's been happening since I was, you know, last there, which was the end of 2017 when I was wrapping up, and you know, see what else I can learn.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're looking forward to seeing your write-up, Linda. No pressure. So we only have about 10 minutes left, but what I want to do is what we've heard now are some things that can be done differently within particular programs, you know, for batterers, batter intervention, or for domestic violence programs, and how this all might fit together. I think that we're in the process of figuring that out. And I want to see if there's anybody who has some ideas or is working with ideas in communities. It does seem to me that this is another lesson, and that we have to knock down our silos to actually solve this issue. And I would love to hear if there are other communities like El Dorado that are in the process of doing this.
Jane, if I could, before we jump into that, especially since we have such little time, I do want to raise up our communities of color, and specifically from the perspective that when I met Steve Halley, we were invited to a roundtable in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that came up there was that a lot of these systems are actually detrimental to us, right? The numbers of us men and women, which is growing sadly, that are in prison are just monumental, right? So, and the impact of COVID-19 on our communities of color, and the stress that it brings, and the levels of domestic violence that are occurring. So I do hope that we continue this conversation. I think this is just a starter. You know, there's so much here. There's so much to learn from each other, so much to share. But I didn't want to let that piece go, because there's a lot of suffering out there right now, and we need to figure out how to stem it, how to help it, how to alleviate it. So yeah, definitely.
So if we can, you know, I think we should address both things. Is what can be done? What can we do immediately if anybody's doing anything differently, or in this time of COVID-19, especially for the people who are hurting the most. And then if there are any people who are working with communities to start taking this non-siloed approach, a more integrated approach in this. So if there's anybody who wants to shout out.
Yeah, if anyone wants to maybe raise your hand, I'm kind of looking through folks. Or I think you could just speak up if you have a comment. Anyone have one? Or a good question? There were
So
Jane, somebody's gonna offer.
Gloria? Oh, sorry. I clicked it and then you clicked it. Let's see. Can you unmute it, Gloria? There we go.
Okay. I just would like to share with you that we are working with pregnant women, and we know how sometimes they experience more violence from their partners during pregnancy. And what we are doing right now is really to invite the future father of the baby as part of our approach in terms of perinatal child parent psychotherapy. And it seems that it has been very helpful, not only for the mother who is pregnant, but also for the father to be able to have a space in which he can reflect and learn about the impact of becoming a father, you know, and what are the issues that are coming up for him. And so, and going back to what James was saying, most of the families that we are working with are coming from Latin American. They are Latin American families. So it has been, I totally agree with the fact that we really need to include the whole family system.
and where are you doing this, Gloria?
I work with Alicia Lieberman, a child trauma research program here in San Francisco.
Oh,
Great.
cool. I'll
So
be there soon.
yeah, I'm glad that you all are doing that, because the way we've been doing things obviously isn't working for everybody. And since we're all about a better normal, we want to create that. So any other ideas or suggestions? I think that, well, we have a question from Diane.
Yeah, Diane, you should be able to unmute yourself, Diane.
Hi there. Yeah. So my question was, you know, it's making me feel really hopeful to hear people from so many different fields, kind of using similar tools that are strengths-based, non-punitive, et cetera. My question was, does anyone else have experience with empowerment-based self-defense that's trauma-informed, that would be workshops to support victim survivors and also children and families around things like de-escalation, managing emotions, positioning yourself for safety, boundaries, self-care practices, you know, those types of things from a trauma-informed lens. I don't know if that's part of anybody's experience, but that's part of the work that I do.
That's awesome. Diane, I've never heard it called that, but that is exactly the skills we use in the batter intervention program, and also teaching them how they could also employ some of those with their own family members. Especially kids.
Yeah, and the healthy relationship skills too, you know, how do you know, I mean, everything from how do you know when you're tired or hungry to how do you know when you're anxious or angry and what can you do, and, you know, skills for empathy, pro-social learning, you know, I think that these communities often are not in contact with each other, and I'm just so excited to hear the curriculum that you all are using. So I hope there's a way to stay in touch.
That's great. Nikki's got her thumbs up.
Diane, are you doing a program right now that that?
Yeah, I do a variety of programs in different places. I mean, not right now with the sheltering in place, although it's kind of a national, international network working on doing more online things. I tend to work more with shelters and social service agencies, work with Native women in recovery, work a lot with LGBTQ youth. So those are the communities I work with a lot, but also immigrants and refugees. I mean, it kind of depends on where the work is needed. I'm not with an agency, but I've worked with a lot of different agencies.
And so are you seeing a shift to moving away from punitive to, you know, in this understanding of ACEs science and the knowledge that we've gotten from that, that there's beginning to be any of that?
Yeah, well, I'm seeing a shift in not just teaching people how to defend themselves, but how to engage in healthy ways. And that's where I think we're seeing the neuroscience. So not just like I teach what I call sex positive self-defense, and it's learn how to say no to what you don't want and yes to what you do. And it's the how do we know what the yes is, right? How can we identify our own values and then let that kind of lead us in the kind of relationships we want to have. So more strengths-based, more what do you want to create in your life, and so instead of like, you know, green flags, sort of like what are the green lights? Excuse me, instead of red flags, what are the green lights?
Yeah.
You know, we're coming at it from positives rather than negatives, and we can
Right.
get really different results when we work that way.
So I want to go back to Judy to ask a question that actually relates a bit to what you were talking about, Diane. In this, I mean, you all are probably in the lead in having a community trying to work all together with all the sectors. And you said that law enforcement was a tough nut to crack. I certainly agree from our experience in ACE's connection with engaging. But what other things have been the challenges in bringing people together on this issue?
That's a good question. Just meetings. Anytime you say, I want to like to hold a meeting, that's been a challenge for us, believe it or not. Some of the simple logistic things. One of the things that we're probably going to start doing is, instead of always waiting for people to connect in our groups, is that we are going to have a small, like our public safety sector. It's going to be very small, but then we're going to ask people to do X, Y, Z. Instead of asking them to come to the meeting, we're going to ask them to do some groundwork for us. And that seems, people don't mind that. Law enforcement doesn't mind that. Just tell me what to do. I cannot come to another meeting, but tell me what you want from me. And that's something that has been real positive for us. You know, at first we were trying to like, okay, we need fire, we need, you know, this group and that group to come to these meetings, and it's not working. We're spinning our wheels trying to get people to come, but when we ask them, this is what we need from you, they're responding. So that's something that we're kind of changing how we approach our groups and our systems a little differently.
Judy, that's what we did in Kern County. Was we went to those folks. You know, it takes knowing what you need and then being able to go to them and say, this is what we need from you. Can you help us with that? Then they get buy-in to a meeting. For so many folks, it's like, you know, I remember calling the chief once and I said, I need you at this meeting because of XYZ. I said, I promise I won't waste your time, because I know people that time is valuable. And he showed up and he stuck to us like Velcro. I mean, it was awesome, but I had to know that this is what I need you for. This is what I know you can provide. So good luck with that.
No, that's great.
Thanks, that's great. Well, I want to give Adriana, did you have a question? And then we'll have to wrap up. Allison?
I don't have a question. What I do have is a statement. So basically, it's about people speaking up and needing to speak up, and it's also about government organisations. So in New Zealand, we have Oranga Tamariki, who is the Ministry of Children, and when they go in and take babies from their mothers in the hospital, then it sends a message to everybody that we can't trust them. So I'm Māori, I'm Indigenous New Zealander. When agencies do things to us and who feel oppressed, then we don't trust those agencies. And when you don't trust those agencies, you won't go and ask them for help. And people are silenced. And that is the biggest thing, is silence and inconsistency of government agencies. So we don't trust them, we don't go to get help, we don't speak out. And then, so then we've got NGOs who are trying to plug the gap. That's non-government agencies. So basically, I think if the leaders, those people and agencies show compassion and understanding that it's really hard to, if you're in a domestic violent relationship, to get out, then if they understand the dynamics, then they would know how to respond, and then we would build up the trust. So they're not going to make much waves here, I think, because you don't trust them. And that's really important, trust. Yeah.
It underlies everything. That's really, thank you for saying that. And I think that we have a lot of mending to do in this work before we even start any kind of progress. So thank you for bringing that up. I greatly appreciate that. So we are over, and I want to respect people's time. Thank you so much. We will come back again because I want to dive deeper into this and get some other examples. If you have other things that you want to add, feel free to email me, jstevens@acesconnection.com, or Allison, acebula@acesconnection.com, before we do this again, which I think will probably be in another 2 or 3 weeks, somewhere around there. But
yeah, we're so booked. We have so many good Better Normals coming up. So I hope that you all will continue to join us because we have so many. We're like booked up. So yeah, it'll be a couple weeks, but there's so much more here to discuss. I already learned so much.
So I just want to thank Nada and James and Judy so much for coming, and Linda for being here and providing that very interesting tidbit about just this. I feel like we're scratching the surface about what happened in Finland. So we will do this again, and I'll turn it back over to Allison to close.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I just want to welcome everyone, especially since so many of you are here for the first time, that if you're not a member already of ACES Connection, we invite you to join. We have 43,000 members, and we are co-creating this community. And I just want to say thank you to all of you who are creating this community with us. We're just so grateful to have you all as part of this community, and so grateful to have you on today's call. I'm noticing some great comments, like Jessica just left one about alternatives to violence. Jessica, I would love for you to make that a post on ACES Connection so that we know more about what that is, because our community would love to know more about what that is. So in order to make a post, you just go to our website, you log in. If you're not a member, you join as a member and you log in and you click the post button. It's in the upper right-hand corner. It's super, super easy. And we invite you all to do that. And we love getting content. There's several different types of posts you can do. You can do a main blog, you can do an ask the community. And so we hope to see you over on our website. Our next Better Normal is Thursday. It's a series about education. And Friday is Danielle. Do you know what that one is, Jane?
That's another community approach to addressing this. Danielle is talking with Kanwar Paul Dhaliwal from RISE and the work she's doing in West Contra Costa County.
Cool. And so that one, I just want you all to know, is going to be an hour later start time than normal. So just make a note of that if you plan on joining us. And we hope to see you back here soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.